So thanks very much for having me. In particular, I'm very grateful to you allowing me to speak in English. That's very kind. Today I'm presenting an element or a component of my PhD research, which is an ethnographic history of the Church of Scotland mission in colonial Kenya. In particular, I look at the mission's engagements and entanglements with Gikuyu culture and the missionaries' attempt to transform physical culture in central Kenya, which put the body in question. It's for this reason that I engage in the thesis with this notion of biopower, which I take to incorporate both notions of disciplinary power, so the training of individuals and the improvement of the individual on the micro scale, but also a concern with the well-being and health of the population, so biopower operating on these two scales. And in my thesis, I show how missionaries, so they operate outside the colonial state. They're not a part of the colonial state. They're part of an informal empire who pursue this program of trying to improve the bodies of the native African and also the population at large by running schools and hospitals and in their mission stations. There is one key historical event in the period that I study in my thesis, which is in 1929, when the mission society that I'm studying, Church of Scotland Mission, launched this big, spectacular campaign, public campaign, against the Gikuyu practice of female circumcision. And I use this term female circumcision because that was the word that was used at the time. They used the word circumcision to refer to the fact that it referred not simply to excision or cutting, but was part of a rite of initiation, a rite of passage. So the language is important and political, whether you use the word circumcision or cutting or excision. But the circumcision crisis launched a big it refers to a political crisis when the colonial state was forced to intervene to calm the tensions between the missionaries and Gikuyu people who tried to resist this attempt to deconstruct their culture the mode of resistance that was adopted was that this was an attempt by the missionaries to trash Gikuyu culture and customs. So I'm going to describe this event today. The circumcision crisis has generated a significant amount of literature already. But the dominant concerns in that literature are on the politics of the circumcision crisis. So the focus is on the institutional level and the debates that happened between politicians and missionaries and Gikuyu nationalist leaders about what to do about circumcision. So my approach is to try and take a cultural approach to this debate, to ask cultural questions about it. At the same time, these cultural debates or the cultural studies of the circumcision question ignore the materiality of the contest. While I'm trying to marry a political account that attends to culture and society, I'm also trying to provide a cultural account that incorporates a close attention to the body and the materiality of practices and everyday life. In relation to the purpose of this workshop today, Decolonizing Gender, the paper sort of makes three contributions, I think. The first is that it provides a lot of ethnographic detail and historical detail. It's largely an empirical account. This is based on the premise that to deconstruct enduring colonial epistemologies, such as gender, we need not only theoretical innovation, but also empirical expansion to explore these moments when gender becomes gained currency in events. I try to address vernacular or Gikuyu constructions of gender, fertility and sexuality, and then provide this account of the Church of Scotland's mission, by the Church of Scotland mission, to interrupt vernacular understandings of gender and sexuality and introduce colonial models. Also, I'm speaking here to the topic of FGM, which is very current today, and so I hope that the paper indirectly provides a deeper history of the FGM debate.
What is the FGM?
Female genital mutilation. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to read a little. First of all, I'll describe now what I mean by the circumcision crisis. That is the political events, the series of events that unfolded in Kenya in 1929. It began in March 1929, in the month of March, when a 15-year-old Gikuyu girl, who was a scholar at the Gospel Missionary Society, was seized by one of her father's wives and another woman and forcibly circumcised. Genital cutting was part of Gikuyu initiation ceremonies, and this attack on the girl in March 1929 took place on the day when she was supposed to be initiated. The girl had previously told her family that she was not going to go through with the ceremony. A few months before this, this is a map of the area that we're talking about. So Kenya in relation to Africa, and all of the events that we're talking about take place within this box here in central Kenya, or called Gikuyu land. In Gikuyu land, a law had been passed by a body called the Kiambu Local Native Council, a council of native chiefs who were appointed by the colonial government. And under pressure from the colonial government, this body had introduced a resolution that aimed to modify and regulate female circumcision among Gikuyu. The resolution outlawed the so-called brutal form of the rite, allowing excision of the clitoris only and prohibiting the cutting of the surrounding tissue. The resolution further stated that the consent of the girl was needed before any circumcision ceremony could take place. So the two women who forcibly circumcised the girl were brought to a colonial court and sat before the district commissioner Vidal, who convicted them under this resolution, under this bylaw. But he fined the women only 30 shillings each, like 1 week's worth of work. At this moment, the leader of the Church of Scotland mission, Dr. John Arthur, who had been struggling against Gikuyu initiation rites for 2 decades, entered the scene. He was incensed that this sentence of the two women was excessively, and considered it excessively lenient. He made a big public appeal, saying that the women should receive a more severe punishment, and they should be sentenced under the Indian Penal Code, which was the basis of Kenya's native legal system. So Dr. Arthur claimed that the women were guilty of grievous hurt and that they should receive at least 4 months rigorous imprisonment. But his appeal was dismissed and the original ruling was upheld. He then wrote a letter to the East African Standard, the weekly newspaper in colonial Kenya, which condemned the ruling of the colonial court. At this point, rumours circulate throughout the Gikuyu Native Reserve. So when I refer to the Gikuyu Native Reserve, there was a big area of land in between Nairobi down here and Mount Kenya that was closed off and reserved only for Kikuyu people. And the reason they sectioned that land off was to allow then areas around here, and particularly in this Naivasha area, to be taken by white settlers. So throughout the Kikuyu Native Reserve then, rumours begin to spread that Dr. Arthur is leading a colonial conspiracy to abolish all Kikuyu customs. On the 17th of August, a group called the Kikuyu Central Association, which is a group of young men and who had once been mission educated but had now turned against the missions, and were protesting against such things as land theft and taxation, sent a letter around to all the Kikuyu chiefs and headmen announcing this conspiracy and telling people to be ready for a battle to defend their customs. At this moment, Dr. Arthur in the Church of Scotland mission decides to introduce a policy in all of the Church of Scotland mission stations, where there were maybe 3,000 Gikuyu Christians, that they had to sign a pledge of loyalty to the church and denounce the Kikuyu custom of circumcision and the Kikuyu Central Association. They asked men to vow that their daughters would not be circumcised. The mission hugely underestimated the purchase that it had on the hearts and minds of its converts, and 90% of the church's population left the mission, and but they didn't abandon Christianity, but they left membership of the church, and they decided that they would no longer receive communion in the church. For this reason, there are a number of other mission societies of different Christian denominations working in Kenya, and a number of the other missionary societies decide not to enforce the ban, but the Church of Scotland mission stands firm in its stance, maintains this stance. There's unrest throughout the Kikuyu Reserve and protests, and a big form of the protest includes this huge dance called the Muthirigu dance that might involve thousands of young men and women dancing. And the dance was a violent dance, and the lyrics promised that threatened Europeans and accused Europeans of sexual deviancy. Sinister things begin to happen. So, for example, pets like small cats and dogs at the mission stations are taken or are speared or set on fire. And there's a general sense of unease that the missionaries' actions were going to bring trouble for all the Europeans in colonial Kenya. The leader of the Kikuyu Central Association, which is claiming to speak for Kikuyu people at this time, is Johnstone Kenyatta, who later changed his name to Jomo Kenyatta and became the first president of independent Kenya. But he had formerly been a mission student at the Church of Scotland. This is him when he was a mission student there. The government was very unsettled by this. And privately, colonial administrators exchanged all of these letters deciding what they're going to do about the question of female circumcision. It adopts a position of neutrality and tries to mediate between the missionaries and Gikuyu people. But it also condemns strongly the actions of the mission in trying to enforce this ban and causing unnecessary political turbulence. Then, on New Year's Day 1930, an American female missionary is taken from her home and is herself genitally mutilated before being killed. At this time, the question of female circumcision becomes a big issue in Britain, in the metropole, and becomes a cause pursued by humanitarian groups, including the British Labour Party and the first female members of Parliament, Catherine Ramsay and Eleanor Rathbone. In Johnstone Kenyatta at this time is a student in London, and they interview him as he is interviewed by colonial officials in London, interrogating him about what is happening about circumcision. So then this tension continues into 1930 and 1931, but in the end the colonial government never pursue a full ban. They never legislate against circumcision beyond prohibiting the brutal form. So the government decide not to ban circumcision, and they don't listen to the missionaries. So that's the circumcision crisis. I now want to go beneath this narrative a little and look at the role of circumcision and genital cutting among Gikuyu people. Gikuyu people were agriculturalists, and the name Gikuyu or community, they were formed during the 16th and 19th century, settling the forests of highland Kenya. In fact, Gikuyu claimed throughout the colonial period that they were the first colonizers of Kenya. That it was Gikuyu who introduced settlement to Kenya by taming the forest wilderness and beginning an agricultural way of life there. So Gikuyu developed a human-powered economy that was orientated around men. Male household heads sourced labour through marriage and procreation, accumulating wives, it was polygamous, and children who would work to produce wealth. In the homestead, women and children undertook the heavy work of planting, weeding and harvesting, while men did the work of defending the land and making decisions. It was a very precarious social and natural environment in central Kenya, where there were famines and disease epidemics, which placed an extreme emphasis on physical strength, fertility, and reproduction. These early years, these pre-colonial years, where Gikuyu settled the forest, embedded these twin moral concepts of mastery over nature and mastery over the self. And these are two Gikuyu ideas that become very powerful in the later Mau Mau struggle in the 1950s, where they used the phrase "Ithaka na wiathi," which meant land and freedom, or nature and power, or mastery over nature and mastery over the self. And it's within this and this strict moral code of cautious, disciplined relationships between genders and individual self-control that we should understand circumcision. The ceremony of Irua, or initiation, reinforced sexual discipline and sought to produce fertility, as well as self-controlling individuals. Initiation ceremonies sought to develop the bodies of young people and restore the health of the community at large, the body politic. It inducted children into a gendered adulthood. So initiation and circumcision was aimed at turning boys into men and girls into women. But at the same time, it also inaugurated a new level of society. Those who were initiated together became members of an age set or a cohort, which they would remain members of for the rest of their life. So in this way, Irua, or initiation, renewed the society. And as this age set was formed, the parents of the initiates would progress to the ranks of senior elders. If initiation ceremonies were delayed, or if they didn't happen, then the community risked becoming polluted or dying. So it was necessary that these initiation ceremonies should take place every year. But they didn't happen in the same way, or exactly the same way, in exactly the same time throughout the whole of Gikuyu land. They are highly localized affairs, and initiation ceremonies might only involve a dozen children being initiated at one time. Girls were initiated probably it would have worked out around the age of 10 to 14 years old, and they were initiated before they began menstruating. Boys were not initiated until they had displayed their readiness to become men. And they had to display their readiness to become men, we are told, by engaging in special dances, dressing in fantastic garb, stealing food, and harassing women. Premarital chastity, boys might have been anywhere between 15 and 30 when they were initiated. Premarital chastity was an ideal for both men and women, and the candidates going in to be initiated were expected to be virgins. But the burden of expectation fell most heavily on girls, who were verbally interrogated and physically examined. Irua was about rebirth, and it drew on the language and repertoires of birth and birthing. So the initiates would go into the homestead of a host elder and his wife, and the host elder and wife would be referred to as the parents and the initiates as their children. The candidates might be placed on a simple diet or special diet of beans, grains, oil and water. Their heads were shaved, and all their body hair was removed in preparation for initiation. And in the evening before, they would have special substances sprayed onto their body. Part of this was a ceremony in which a male elder would spray mouthfuls of honey and milk and medicine onto the chests of the initiates, boys and girls, imparting to them bravery and endurance. And then a female elder would spray another mixture of substances onto their chests that was said to protect the initiates for the rest of their life from bad temptations and attacks of evil spirits. So while these bodily techniques are happening, the initiates also received special guidance for members of the older, members of their sex, but older members of their sex. So boys received guidance from men, and girls received guidance from women in the correct behaviour of gendered adulthood. The cut took place very early in the morning. Both male and female candidates would be taken to a river and bathed bathed waist deep in cold water to numb their bodies. They would then be processed back into a forest clearance, one clearance for boys and one clearance for the girls. Each candidate would squat with a nominated sponsor, again, an older member of the sex, standing behind them. And they would look up to the sky and await the arrival of the moridia, which is a specialized circumciser. The circumciser would enter this clearance with a special razor blade, dancing and singing. A whole crowd of spectators, a gendered crowd of spectators, men would crowd around the boys and women would crowd around the girls and build up excitement to increase the candidates' adrenaline so that they may pass the cutting part of the ceremony successfully. Male initiation involved the cutting of the foreskin. Girls had their clitoris excised, and this is what caused the problem. Sometimes all of the labia was also cut away. It was extensive cutting. The circumciser would use the same blade to cut all of the candidates together, and it was important that in this ceremony of sharing the same blood to reaffirm this membership of the same group. And at the same time, it was important that the blood and flesh fell onto the land where the ancestors were buried, to reaffirm the connection with the ancestors. A lot has been written on the symbolic significance of removing foreskins and clitorises. And it's said that these body parts are supposed to represent childhood. But there was also, but this kind of overlooks the physiological aspect. These body parts were said to heighten sexual arousal. and to distract a person. So the clitoris and the foreskin actually made the person more childish. So by removing them, you made the person more reliable and less susceptible to lapses in concentration. So genital cutting was an act of sexual disciplining. And but if sexual discipline was a crucial component of initiation, this was especially so in relation to women. So Jomo Kenyatta, in his account of female circumcision, explicitly stated, and this is a quote, that the motive of trimming the clitoris was to prevent girls from developing sexual feelings around that point. At the same way, initiation ceremony was supposed to heighten fertility, but again, this also emphasized the woman. It was believed that a woman could not have a healthy pregnancy if she had not been circumcised. It was also the phenomenology of the rite and the materiality of the rite was also significant, in that the candidates had to experience the pain. It was through experiencing this pain and overcoming it that they became mature. At the moment of being cut by the knife, the candidate had to prove that they could contain and discipline their inner urges and withhold their emotions. It was crucial that they did not register any pain or express any discomfort. And if a candidate did this, then they risked failing the test of initiation and being branded a kirogi or a coward for the rest of their lives. I said that initiation sort of drew on the repertoires of childbirth, and there is a whole procedure then that follows the cutting that recreated the womb-like experience. So the candidates were taken off to a place of seclusion, which represented or reenacted the womb, where they were treated with special oils, and their wounds were dressed, and they were fed huge amounts of food, and were told not to expend any unnecessary energy. During this period of seclusion, which could last up to 1 month while recovering from the hut, in some places in central Kenya, the candidates weren't allowed to speak, and in some places they had to remain with their eyes closed. In other places, candidates weren't allowed to wash or shave for this whole time. So they remain in this kind of state of hibernation before they come out, and there are coming out or being brought out ceremonies, which might also involve the parents who had hosted the initiation having ceremonial sexual intercourse to mimic the reproduction of their children. Then the candidates, once initiated, were considered clean and whole persons. If they were not initiated, they remained in a state of childhood and could have a polluting influence on their community, and their parents could not become elders. During the period of recovery, they also were instructed in the sexual responsibilities of adulthood. So we can see that this ceremony of initiation was focused around sexuality and fertility, both of the individual, but it also restored the well-being of the body politic, of the social. I'll speak for about 10 more minutes. I'll describe what the Church of Scotland Mission's attitudes towards initiation ceremonies. The Church of Scotland Mission had a distinctive, though not unique, approach to colonial evangelism, which sought to civilize first and then Christianize. So in stark contrast to the Italian Catholic Consolata Fathers, who tried to adapt the message, the Church of Scotland Mission believed that they could not convert Gikuyu people without totally overhauling, changing their society and culture. So their mission was conducted on the terrain of physical culture and material living conditions. It's significant that many of the Scottish missionaries were doctors or nurses. Their mission emphasised biomedicine, emphasis on personal hygiene and cleanliness, labour and the dignity of work, the introduction of cotton clothing, sport, vigorous recreation and health. From the start, from when the mission was first established in 1898, in quotations, work among women and girls was a discrete component of their work. But although the missionaries claimed to be championing the, quote, equality of the sexes, their work in this direction with women and girls was oriented around preparing Gikuyu women, creating a class of Gikuyu women who could become the wives of their male converts. So their women's work was about creating dutiful wives. Women were trained in domesticity, hygiene and mothercraft, undertaking lessons in needlework, the feeding of children, cooking and cleaning. In ways in which the missionaries were not always aware, these lessons involved inducting women into novel forms of embodied personhood. I'll just say that I don't have time to properly go into that. Maybe we come back to it later. The missionaries of the Church of Scotland begin to register their concern about initiation rites from the start of the 20th century. With male circumcision, they decide to compromise, offering a modified form of the rite, surgically circumcising teenage boys in the sterile mission hospital. But female genital cutting was much more disturbing for the missionaries. In 1915, they reluctantly experiment with a hybrid form of the rite, inviting to the mission hospital a native circumciser to perform the operation on 3 missionary dormitory girls, Gikuyu dormitory girls. But the mission doctor who witnessed this procedure considered it to be so cruel and brutal that from 1915 onwards there would be no compromising, and the church laws are updated to totally prohibit the custom of circumcision. So unlike Gikuyu boys, Gikuyu girls don't have the option of a middle way. They're either initiated at home or they're not initiated at all and they become Christian. In the mission stations, the missionaries teach that, quote, the circumcision of girls is contrary to the principles of Christianity. The missionaries make medical and moral arguments against circumcision, and often their arguments are divided into the medical and the moral. But this distinction, while it might be analytically useful, it also obscures the significant ways in which the medical overlapped with the moral, and it disguises the fact that the missionaries' project was blended the medical and the moral, and was kind of channeled by their deep desire to discipline and control sexualities. The missionaries espoused totally different ideals about wholesome fertility, what constituted wholesome fertility and healthy reproduction. The missionaries began a big part of the missionaries' campaign against circumcision was writing and circulating very, very graphic and gruesome accounts of circumcision. So they go and witness ceremonies, or sometimes they don't even witness them, and they wrote down brutal descriptions, which are then circulated in medical journals or in the popular newspapers. For example, in one account, Dr. Horace Philp described, quote, that he had seen a native circumciser slicing off whole external genital parts, gouging out much of the lining of the membrane of the vagina as she can get hold of. In these sensationalized accounts, missionaries claimed to, quote, have witnessed cases in which the old circumciser deliberately prolonged the agony and that the girls were crying for mercy and deliverance from their torture. As well as describing the moment of cutting, missionaries also described the short and long-term impacts of the cutting, arguing that it made women susceptible to hemorrhaging, severe pain, shock and death immediately, and also these long-term complications. In one very graphic description that was widely circulated in popular and specialist circles, one woman missionary, Mrs. Brown, described, quote, "A woman's front passage utterly closed up like the palm of a hand. It was not even possible for her to pass urine, or when the menstruation period began, it had to find its way out through the back passage." These really graphic and gruesome descriptions continued, and missionaries spoke of women coming to the mission station for plastic surgery to counteract the ceremony, and their whole systems apparently filled up with poisoned, retained secretions. They also made an argument about the psychological effects of genital cutting. And the missionaries claimed that the brutality of the rite inhibited individual personality and dimmed individual expression, sapping children from energy and rendering them inert. Quotation from the missionaries says, "Uncircumcised boys and girls exhibit a rapidity of comprehension and vivacity of expression which are remarkable, but they show a decrease in these qualities after circumcision." This was held to be especially so in the case of girls, for whom the rite, the missionaries argued, crushed and hardened all womanliness. They made a surprising argument that initiation, surprising for Presbyterian missionaries, that initiation ceremonies dramatically assaulted womanhood by severely limiting the future possibilities of sexual gratification. Above all, the missionaries made a biopolitical argument about the impact genital cutting was having on the population, and argued that it was causing deaths in pregnancy, both deaths of the mother and the child. They claimed that they had never delivered any children without having to make extensive further cuts that put the woman's life at risk, and claimed that the vast majority of women and infants in their maternity ward were dying with first pregnancy. So the Doctors Philp and Doctors Gillen, go so far as to collect data and statistics measuring the pelvises of women in the maternity ward and the skull sizes of the infants who are born, to collect evidence that they claimed showed anatomical malformations in Gikuyu people, and they petitioned to the government on these grounds. But the missionaries also where am I? They also, one missionary, Arthur Barlow, this man, wrote a long article called "Sex and Sex Teaching in Gikuyu Life," in which he argued that in the mission state that initiation was debasing, and that the whole ceremony overemphasized sexuality. So he kind of made an argument that, as well as dimming sexuality, it also enhanced it. So it had a distorting and corrupting influence on the initiate. But he ends this article on sex and sex teaching in Gikuyu life by pointing out how the mission station is promoting healthy reproduction. He wrote about children growing up in the mission station, in the environment of the mission station, being pure-minded and unsullied by the harmful example of sex life. He also made special reference to large families being brought into the world by African Christians. He argued that this was not simply a social or biological success, but also had a moral value, saying that the production of numerous children is to be upheld as a Christian virtue. I wanted to finish with making one more point, and it's exploring the unique ways in which these kind of biopolitical arguments of the missionaries become vernacularized and seized upon by Gikuyu political groups in the circumcision debate. So two Gikuyu political organizations form, and they each have different purposes. One is the one I've referred to already, the Gikuyu Central Association, that seeks to defend the custom of circumcision against so-called cultural imperialism. But the other was a group of Gikuyu men who were loyal to the missionaries, and they argued that the Gikuyu people needed to abandon the custom of circumcision. What these groups shared was that they were both comprised entirely of Gikuyu men, and they each tried to make the question of female circumcision a question about the future of the Gikuyu nation. So the woman's body comes to stand in for the body politic. The Progressive Gikuyu Party, the loyalist group, I'll just read out a quotation that they made in a petition in 1929. They said, "We have left those old barbarous customs. They will not destroy our nation. It will not destroy our nation to leave this custom of female circumcision. We ask the government that this custom, which kills the first children of Gikuyu girls, be ended altogether, just like the English government in India ended the custom of burning widows with their husbands' bodies. We hate all customs which bind Gikuyu and prevent them knowing the true religion and going forward in civilization and becoming a strong people, able to receive their inheritance in mind and body." And they end their petition with, "We want our women to be whole in body, able to speak the truth, so that the government can trust us being a full-grown nation with clean customs." The Gikuyu Central Association argued to the contrary. In this time of colonial chaos, the custom of female circumcision was needed now more than ever before. They argued. Jomo Kenyatta, in his ethnography, Facing Mount Kenya, made this structuralist, functionalist argument, deciding to protect the custom, arguing that the whole moral code of Gikuyu people is bound up with it, and it symbolizes the unification of the tribe. To remove it would introduce tribal breakdown and cause social chaos. In their journal, which was called Mwigwithania, the Gikuyu Central Association used titles of articles which drew on the language of birth and birthing and growth, such as the bearing up of the Gikuyu nation, the enfeebling of the Gikuyu. In one article called "The Beginnings of Insubordination," a Gikuyu Central Association man argued that Gikuyu women who were accumulating wealth in the towns and converting to Christianity were exterminating Gikuyu men and undermining Gikuyu men. The Gikuyu Central Association called for Gikuyu men to reassert a male authority that brought Gikuyu women back under the control of the household and did not drop them by the roadside like millet stalks. So the Kenya colonial government is unmoved by the missionaries' moral arguments of the effect of genital cutting, but the Kenya colonial government does register some concern at the biopolitical argument that circumcision was prohibiting population growth. But ultimately, its policy of neutrality and staying out of this affair endured because of its fears of detribalization, a fear that it shared with the young men of the Gikuyu Central Association. So in this instance, in the circumcision crisis, the biopolitical concern for the well-being, for the state to maintain the well-being of the population, is overridden and overtaken by a sense need for colonial realpolitik. And in this whole debate, it's a debate conducted mostly by Gikuyu men, missionary men, and male colonial administrators. So while native women were at once central to the whole episode of female circumcision, they're also marginalised by it. I think that's all I have to say. I suppose the one broad point that I was reflecting on, what is all this information, how is it all relevant? For me, I think one point we can take from it is that sexuality or gender, when it's used as the primary lens or the primary focus of scholarly inquiry, can really enrich our understanding about a historical period or particular time or place. And with a topic like this, so gender then doesn't become a sort of additional topic which is sectioned off from politics or society or culture. And this topic of the female circumcision crisis in colonial Kenya, it destroys these epistemological boundaries between gender and politics, between politics and culture, and methodologically between anthropology and history, and between medicine and politics. All of these things elide. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Tom, for this very rich intervention, and the description was really rich and
yes,
a good thing too. And your conclusion as well is really interesting. I think we can go back on it maybe with the questions. I think it's very interesting, and we've been really able to realize how institution can create more than just modify the body and the perception that we have of the body, and it's like an embodiment of higher ideologies, and it's so malleable in a way, and it's so subject of social injection to the point to act in return on the political structures. So I think it's really interesting. Yeah. So maybe we go to the questions if some people have some, and we can make the translation.
Thank you very much. So, I was wondering, you at the end of your presentation, you underlined the fact that it was mainly a female question dealt by men, Gikuyu and missionaries, and I was wondering whether you ever noticed the fact in your archives, the fact that I don't know, the sign or a beginning of female protests among Gikuyu, whether for or against this practice. That's my question.
I perfectly understand that you work with archives, but how kind of distance and can you have regarding to this? The documents you are working with, and I was just thinking about this Jomo Kenyatta. You're mentioning a lot, and I don't understand if there are a lot of books or ethnographies of these rituals. But if he is kind of the only one really describing what happened in these rituals, is it not something like a huge bias that this guy then became the president of Kenya, and he had a very kind of nationalist and functionalist way of describing this fantastic cutting blah blah blah. So I was wondering how as an historian can deal with such for sure colonial sources, and in this specific case of Jomo Kenyatta.
It's about when you were talking about the rite of passage when they're in the forest and everything, and the fact that they don't have to express their emotions. Otherwise, the guys would be considered as coward, you said. So I was wondering if maybe it was, I was imagining that maybe it can create a categorization of feminized person. Well, it was just a question.
Yeah.
For men, you said, like,
Yeah,
For men, yeah.
and also like what happened when women do not,
Yeah.
I mean, which needs a
Yeah.
symmetric category.
Yeah. So the question on the role of Gikuyu women during in this whole or their actions, I suppose, during this whole debacle, it kind of relates in a way to the question of sources, because, as you say, it's as a historian, if you're relying on documents, it was men who were writing the documents and who were debating. So it's difficult to know the conversations that took place on the ground between people, and who was dominating those debates. In the medium of print and newspapers, this is men who are speaking all the time. There are a number of very, very sophisticated studies on. There are two quite sophisticated, great books on Gikuyu women during this crisis, where they have focused on how individuals kind of where women use the machinery of colonialism, or these new ethnic nationalist groups to their own advantage. Either sometimes being initiated, because being initiated also confers upon you certain sort of decision-making authority and power within your community, or circumventing it by going to the mission station. Not answering this question very well. I'll have to think about that a little more.
Apparently, they never used the missionaries' arguments to a way of emancipation.
No. Or so there are these. The moment where it comes into the sources is when are in these court cases of false circumcisions, or forced mutations, where there are maybe 20 of these episodes during a 2-year span, where missionary girls are seized and they've said that they're not going to go through with the rite. Yeah, I need to go to that. That would be the source.
It would have been easy to use the voice as an argument, either
But they don't give evidence in these cases, though. So again, it's the people who are giving evidence are often actually even the colonial officers who are interpreting in these court cases, and they interpret on behalf of the defendants. But it could have been given in those cases. Today, as well as the archives, right? This is based on about 12 months of fieldwork in central Kenya, which has involved interviews with the oldest generation of people in central Kenya, and even mostly Presbyterian Kenyans who are maybe second, third generation mission educated, and even then there is this ambivalence around the question of circumcision, where often men or women will say repeatedly, yeah, well, it was bad, but it did keep us disciplined. It did teach people their place in society. The strongest argument that was made to me that it should be reintroduced, the government shouldn't ban it, was made by old women who who themselves had gone through these initiation ceremonies and were firm in their belief that today in Kenya, I mean, central Kenya is sort of, it gets overtaken by these crazes about homosexuality, alcoholism, indiscipline, prostitution, and these old women mobilised those debates to me and said, if we had circumcision today, then we wouldn't have homosexuality, we wouldn't have alcohol addiction, we wouldn't have prostitution. Yeah. I mean, it's always difficult. So the number of there are a number of descriptions of the rite of passage that I draw from to get this ethnographic detail, and the only one that's extensive that was written by a Gikuyu person is Jomo Kenyatta's Facing Mount Kenya, which is 1938, and I tried to problematise it a little bit at the end, saying he's drawing on this structural functionalist argument to show that this is so important to the Gikuyu people. And the reason I was quoting him most of all is because then it doesn't lead you open to the accusation that you're only relying on European sources. So I tried to engage with him most of all, and also because he was directly involved in this Church of Scotland mission, having attended the school there. Yeah.
So it's kind of answering with my question, because you were saying that if, like, the...
Oh yes, yeah. So it was men and women who were supposed to contain this, which seems to draw on this. I mean, it's also the Gikuyu. These initiation ceremonies are quite distinctive in that men and women were initiated simultaneously at the same time, even though they were different ages. They took place on the same day, which I think doesn't always happen in African societies. You know, the initiation of boys and men was very much separate. So, and the fact that initiation boys and girls would be considered brothers and sisters also is also quite important. And they go through the procedures before and after are more or less the same. So the initiation period is more or less identical for boys and men. This idea of containing and withholding, and only it draws on kind of broader repertoires that are clearly apparent in that, you know, who can in public being kind of closed up, and then also only expressing your person in specific circumstances in special circumstances with particular people. The passing of knowledge in initiation ceremonies would always take place in a very delicate way. So old women speaking to young women when nobody else was around. This idea of being closed up and holding in during the actual moment of cutting was part of this broader pattern of containment.
So another question, maybe you already answered it, but very first maybe. How the outsider of the circumcision were, I think, maybe out of the group, they rebuilt gender identity?
Yeah.
Do you know how they did it, or?
Yeah. So these Gikuyu Christians, missionized Gikuyus, that would be what you were referring to. This then becomes, in the 30s, it becomes one of the mission's main agendas on trying to promote the idea of this monogamous household and having these modern Gikuyu monogamous couples, husband and wife, who are not initiated.
But there is no people who are not in the missionary and not in the Gikuyu groups.
In this colonial period, well, I'm sure there must have been, but it's not something I've encountered in the material.
It's difficult to
find it.
To find about the outsider of not missionary. And
Yeah, and I suppose what obscures this whole debate is the fact that there's this very dominant kind of Gikuyu group of this is Gikuyu culture, this is what we do, and then there is this Christian group. So people who did that would have fallen between a gap, or people who adopted bits of Christianity maybe and modernity, and people who and also retained certain Gikuyu cultures. Yeah, and it's a problem in sort of colonial African studies in general, in that these people there's no literature or sources left, or it's very limited sources to recreate that. I'm sorry, I can't answer.
And at the same time, it's interesting that this person who made this ethnography is at the same period.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kenyatta,
Yeah. He Kenyatta's ethnography was like, he did it under Malinowski at the London School of Economics, and again he was probably writing. He was in London during this. He was at the London School of Economics during these events, and was probably writing this manuscript for Facing Down Kenya in the heat of it. His ethnography almost becomes a defence of circumcision.
So science is also embodying political interests.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.